She hid her $200,000 private fund from her fiancé and lived simply until the family reunion at their private island. Before we descend into the shadows of this story, my beautiful family, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever been made to feel small by someone who only measures worth in gold? In this journey, you are going to witness the ultimate subversion of that arrogance. You will watch as Sloane Holloway, a woman who silently moves empires while wearing a simple sundress, faces the wolves of high society. You will see what happens when the people who call her trash realize she is the one who holds the lease on their very existence. Stay with me until the final act, because the moment the check is slid across the table is the moment a dynasty begins to crumble. This is a story for every soul who has been undervalued. Tonight, we reclaim our power together. Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. How is your heart doing today? I know life can be heavy, and sometimes the people we love are the ones who make us feel the lightest. If no one has reminded you today, let me be the one. You are a masterpiece, and your value is intrinsic, not incidental. May the Almighty wrap you in a blanket of peace that no storm can tear away, and may those who try to diminish you find themselves standing in the shadow of your inevitable success. Drop a heart in the comments so I know you are here with me. And before we begin, let me ask you this. Do not let your own story be left behind in the silence. If you believe that character matters more than a bank account, and if you want to be part of a family that stands for justice and resilience, subscribe to this channel right now. Do not be left behind while others find their strength. Join us, stay safe, and let's ensure that no bully ever goes unanswered again. Let's set all that aside and dive into another story together. The hum of the city felt like a distant memory inside Sloane Holloway's studio apartment. It was a space designed for invisibility. The walls were a muted eggshell, the furniture was a collection of sturdy, unbranded oak, and the only luxury was the absolute silence she had purchased with her own anonymity. Sloane sat at a small, scarred wooden desk, her fingers flying across a customized hardware terminal that looked like a piece of vintage radio equipment but held the processing power of a small server farm. On the screen, a digital ledger flickered with a green glow that illuminated her rich, luminous dark brown skin. Monthly private yield, $200,412.88. It was her shadow fund, a personal dividend she had built from years of high-frequency hedge fund architecture. To the world of global finance, Sloane was a ghost, a legend spoken of in hushed tones as the guardian of the markets. But to Barrett Montgomery, she was just Sloane, the girl who spent her weekends volunteering at the public library and bought her clothes at end-of-season sales. She had lived this lie for 18 months. It was a test, a long-game audit of the heart. After being pursued by men who saw her as a trophy or a line item on their own balance sheets, Sloane had built a fortress of simplicity. She wanted to know if a man could love the soul behind the sundress, or if he was just waiting for the dress to be silk. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the door broke her concentration. Sloane didn't panic. She simply tapped a key, and the high-security interface vanished, replaced by a screensaver of a generic spreadsheet. She slid the hardware key into a worn canvas tote bag hanging on the back of her chair, the very bag Barrett mocked for its poverty aesthetic. "Come in, Barrett," she called out, her voice softening into the gentle, composed tone she reserved for him. Barrett Montgomery stepped into the room, looking like a man who had been forced to walk through a swamp. He was wearing a tailored navy blazer and a pair of loafers that cost more than Sloane's monthly rent. He looked around the studio with a familiar, thin-lipped expression of restrained distaste. "Honestly, Sloane, I don't know how you can think in here," Barrett said, dropping a thick, gold-embossed envelope onto her desk. "It's so cramped. It smells like old books and lack of ambition." "It's peaceful, Barrett," Sloane replied, standing up to meet him. "And the rent is paid for the next 6 months. That's a luxury in this city." "It's a survival tactic, not a luxury," Barrett countered, his voice sharp with the arrogant bully energy he usually reserved for his subordinates at Montgomery Construction. "But that doesn't matter now. Look at the envelope. My family's annual reunion is this weekend. On the island." Sloane picked up the envelope. She knew the island. It was a private rock in the Atlantic that she had quietly purchased through a shell company 3 months ago when the previous owners went bankrupt. She had intended to keep it as a nature preserve, but she hadn't realized Barrett's family held a legacy lease on the Central Manor. The Montgomery Reunion of the Elite, Sloane read, a micro hook of irony tugging at her lips. Are you sure you want me there, Barrett? You said last time that my presence made it hard for you to network. Barrett sighed, his hands on his hips. Look, my mother, Genevieve, is being difficult. She thinks I'm wasting my time with a project like you. I need you there to show them that you can at least follow instructions. This weekend is critical. My father is expecting the guardian investor, the person who saved the firm, to make an appearance. If we secure that partnership, I finally get my seat on the board. Sloane looked at him, searching for even a flicker of the man who had claimed to love her for her simple spirit a year ago. And what if the investor doesn't show, Barrett? Am I still enough for you if you never get that seat? Barrett paused, and the silence was more eloquent than any insult. Let's just worry about your wardrobe, Sloane. Pack that little cotton sundress. It makes you look harmless. And for God's sake, leave that canvas tote at home. It makes you look like a college student on a budget. I think I'll keep the bag, Barrett, Sloane said, her voice dropping to a sophisticated, dangerous hum. It holds everything I need. Barrett didn't notice the steel in her voice. He was already checking his reflection in the small mirror by the door, oblivious to the fact that the liability he was bringing to his family's island was the only reason his family still had a name to boast about. As he walked out, Sloane reached into the canvas bag and felt the cold metal of the hardware key. The test was reaching its final phase. She had lived in the shadow for him, but this weekend, she would see if he was worth the light she actually controlled. The journey to the coast began not in a private car, but on the rattling silver spine of the city's subway system. Barrett stood near the doors, his expensive leather briefcase held high to avoid touching the grime of the morning commute. He looked at Sloane, who was seated calmly, her canvas tote resting in her lap, her eyes focused on the passing tunnel lights with a quiet, composed intensity. I don't know why you insisted on the train, Sloane, Barrett hissed over the screech of the metal wheels. I could have called a car. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You have this obsession with being ordinary. It's a liability when you're trying to move into my world. The train gets us there 10 minutes faster than the morning traffic, Barrett, Sloane replied, her voice soft but unyielding. Efficiency isn't a liability. It's an asset. Barrett scoffed, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the dark window. Efficiency is for people who can't afford to be late. Status is for people who don't care if they are. My mother is already going to be looking for reasons to dismiss you. Arriving with the smell of the subway on your clothes is just giving her ammunition. Sloane looked at him, feeling the atmospheric drop of his increasing arrogance. She thought about the $200,412.88 that had hit her account that morning, money that could buy a fleet of cars, yet she chose the train to see if he could handle the reality of a common life. If your mother dismisses me because of the way I travel, Barrett, then she isn't looking at me at all. She's looking at a ticket stub. That's exactly the kind of philosophy that makes you sound poor, Sloane, Barrett snapped. Just try to be invisible until we get to the island. I have too much riding on this weekend to let your simplicity ruin the Montgomery image. As the train pulled into the final station near the docks, Sloane stood up, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Little did Barrett know, that ordinary bag contained the hardware keys to the very firm he was trying to impress his parents with. He was so focused on this subway snob aesthetic that he failed to notice he was traveling with the most powerful person in the city. At the private marina, the air changed. The scent of salt and diesel was masked by the smell of high-end sunblock and expensive champagne. Barrett led the way toward the Montgomery family slip, his chest puffed out as he nodded to the other arrogant bullies, preparing their vessels for the weekend. Sloane followed, her simple cotton sundress fluttering in the sea breeze. She clutched her canvas tote, her fingers brushing against the cold, metallic edges of the hardware terminal hidden inside. Barrett, a voice boomed from a sleek, 80-foot yacht nearby. It was a colleague from the firm, a man named Sterling who Nora Thorne had dismantled in a previous life. Sterling, good to see you, Barrett called back, his voice taking on a performative, high-status lilt. The man looked at Sloane, then at the canvas bag. Who's the help, Barrett? Did you forget your luggage at the terminal? Barrett's face flushed. This is Sloane. She's with me. She likes the organic look. Sterling laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Organic? Looks more like recessional to me. Hope she's better at conversation than she is at fashion, or your mother is going to have her serving the shrimp. Barrett didn't defend her. He laughed along, a weak, cowardly sound that made Sloane's jaw tighten. She's just here for the weekend, Sterling. Don't worry about it. They reached the Montgomery boat, a massive power catamaran. Barrett turned to Sloane, his eyes hard. Give me the bag, Sloane. I'll hide it in the cabin. If my father sees you carrying that trash onto the boat, he'll think I'm dating a student. I'm keeping the bag, Barrett, Sloane said, her voice now possessing a sophisticated, dangerous power. It holds everything I need for this weekend, including my exit strategy. Exit strategy? What are you talking about? Nothing, Sloane said, stepping onto the boat without waiting for his hand. Just make sure that Guardian Investor is the only thing your father is looking for, because he might not like what he finds when he looks at the people right in front of him. The island rose from the Atlantic like a fortress of green and gold. As the boat approached the private jetty, Sloane saw the familiar white stones of the manor house perched on the cliffs. This was her island, purchased through a shell company to protect the local reefs, but to the Montgomerys, it was their ancestral playground. As the catamaran docked, a team of security guards in crisp white uniforms stood at attention. They weren't just Montgomery staff, they were contractors from a firm Sloane personally vetted for her logistics empire. As Sloane stepped off the boat, the lead guard, a man named Miller, caught her eye. His posture shifted instantly, a micro-hook of recognition. He began to lower his head in a formal bow, a sign of respect for the guardian who paid his salary. Sloane gave a sharp, imperceptible shake of her head. Miller froze, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression back into professional stone. "Welcome back, Mr. Montgomery," Miller said to Barrett, ignoring Sloane as per her silent command. "Good to see you, Miller," Barrett said, throwing his keys to the guard. "Make sure the luggage is handled. And this guest will be staying in the garden cottage, not the main house." Sloane felt the sting of the insult, but she maintained her naive composure. The garden cottage was where the help stayed. "The cottage is fine, Barrett," Sloane said, clutching her canvas tote. "I like the view of the gates from there." "Good. Because Genevieve has a very specific seating chart for the welcome dinner," Barrett said, not looking back at her as he headed toward the manor. "And you're not on it." Miller lingered for a moment after Barrett left. He leaned in toward Sloane, his voice a low, respectful whisper. "Ma'am, the hardware is secure in the manor's primary hub. Your instructions? Stay alert, Miller," Sloane whispered back, her eyes tracking Barrett's retreating form. "The character clause is in effect. If I see one drop of arrogance tonight, we pull the plug on the Montgomery firm before the sun sets." The private jetty was just the beginning. The arrogant bullies thought they were hosting a charity case, but the landlord had just arrived, and she was carrying the keys to their destruction in a canvas bag. The garden cottage was a picturesque insult. It was a structure of weathered cedar and climbing ivy, beautiful in its own right, but situated several hundred yards behind the towering marble shadow of the Montgomery Manor. As Sloane stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and damp earth. She placed her canvas tote on the small, unadorned iron bed and felt the atmospheric drop of her status in Barrett's eyes. "Is this where you want me, Barrett?" Sloane asked, her voice calm and level as she turned to face him in the doorway. Barrett didn't step inside. He stood on the threshold, checking his watch with a sharp, controlled gaze that conveyed a mix of authority and restrained tension. "It's only for 2 nights, Sloane. The main house is full of legacy members and board directors. You'll be more comfortable here, away from the scrutiny." "Scrutiny, or the truth?" Sloane countered, her rich caramel skin glowing in the late afternoon sun. Before Barrett could answer, a shadow fell across the porch. Genevieve Montgomery arrived like a cold front, her presence hyper-attractive but socially dominant and entirely unsmiling. She wore a tailored linen executive suit in a shade of bone white that matched the clinical coldness of her expression. "Barrett, the caterers are short-staffed for the welcome gala," Genevieve stated, looking through Sloane as if she were a piece of transparent glass. "Since your guest is already dressed in that simple little sundress, she can help with the appetizer service. It'll give her something to do besides lingering in corners." Barrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't offer a word of defense. "Of course, Mother. Sloane is very handy. She's used to being helpful. Sloane felt a micro-hook of the silent powerhouse within her. She reached into her canvas bag, her fingers brushing the hardware key that controlled the very funds currently paying for the champagne Genevieve was so worried about serving. "I'd be happy to help, Genevieve," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a sophisticated, dangerous hum. "It's always enlightening to see how a party is managed from the inside." "Good," Genevieve snapped, finally looking Sloane in the eye with a gaze of quiet superiority. "Report to the kitchen in 10 minutes. And for heaven's sake, do something with that hair. You look like you just stepped off a bus." As they walked away, Sloane sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. She checked her private fund. Monthly yield, $200,412.88. She was being ordered to serve shrimp by people who were technically her tenants. The glass partition between her reality and their illusion was about to shatter, but she would wait until the dinner was served to let the first crack appear. The welcome gala was a sea of navy blazers, silk pocket squares, and the suffocating smell of expensive cigars and aged scotch. Sloane moved through the crowd with a silver tray balanced on one hand, her posture composed and socially dominant despite the white apron pinned over her sundress. She was a ghost in the machine, weaving between billionaires who didn't even notice her unless their glass was empty. "More Prosecco here, girl," a man barked, not even turning his head toward her. Sloane leaned in, her luminous skin catching the amber glow of the chandeliers. "It's a vintage Franciacorta, sir. A bit more refined than Prosecco." The man blinked, surprised by the sophistication in her voice, but Genevieve was suddenly there, her eyes flashing with a warning. "Just pour the drink, Sloane. We aren't here for a lecture on viticulture." Across the room, Sloane saw Barrett. He was laughing with a group of board members, his masculine jawline set in a mask of old money confidence. Not once did he look toward her. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who had helped him draft his project proposals for the last year. He was busy networking, building a future on a foundation he didn't realize was made of Sloane's secret money. "The Guardian investor should be here by tomorrow," Barrett's father, Richard, announced to a small circle of elite guests. "They've been quiet lately, but our CFO says the bridge loan is finalized. We're untouchable." Sloane poured a glass for Richard, her eyes meeting his for a split second. He saw a server. She saw a man who had just unknowingly signed over the lien on his family's soul to her. "Liquid arrogance," Sloane whispered to herself as she retreated toward the kitchen. She passed Miller, the security head, near the terrace. He didn't bow this time, but his eyes were fixed on her with a profound, terrified respect. "Ma'am," he murmured, his back to the crowd. "The CFO is trying to reach the Guardian for a confirmation code. The island's operating expenses are being flagged as excessive by the automated audit." "Let them flag it, Miller," Sloane replied, her voice a sophisticated purr. "If they want the lights to stay on for the main event, they'll have to find a way to impress the landlord. And right now, the landlord is very unimpressed with the service." The gala transitioned into a formal sit-down dinner in the Grand Hall, a room of dark mahogany and vaulted ceilings designed to make the Montgomerys feel like royalty. As the guests took their seats according to an intricate, status-driven chart, Sloane stood by the sideboard, her silver tray empty but her gaze intense and controlled. Barrett sat at the center of the main table, flanked by Genevieve and a young woman in a designer gown who looked at him with the predatory intent of a social climber. Sloane watched as Barrett laughed, leaning in to whisper something in the woman's ear. He looked like a man who had already forgotten the liability he had brought to the island. "Sloane," Genevieve called out, her voice cutting through the dinner chatter. "There seems to be a mistake. You're still standing here." "I was waiting for the final seating, Genevieve," Sloane said, her voice possessing a quiet superiority that made several guests look up. Genevieve let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "The final seating for the staff is in the kitchen, dear. We've set up a lovely little table near the prep station for you. You look like you'd be more comfortable there anyway, surrounded by your own level." The room went quiet. Barrett looked up, his face flushing with a mix of cowardice and restrained tension. He didn't stand. He didn't object. He simply looked back down at his salad, effectively cutting the last thread of his loyalty to the woman who loved him. "The kitchen?" Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, sophisticated hum. "It's where the nothing people go, Sloane," Richard added, his voice booming with a false authority. "Don't ruin the evening by making a scene. Just take your plate and go. We have important business to discuss. Business that doesn't concern a freelance assistant." Sloane looked at the Montgomery family, the arrogant bullies who thought they had successfully discarded a human being like a piece of faulty equipment. She felt the character clause in her heart lock into place. "You're right, Richard," Sloane said, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "Business is being discussed, but I think you'll find that the nothing people are the only ones who actually know how the machines work. Enjoy your dinner. I'll be in the kitchen, making a phone call." As she walked away, Barrett finally looked at her, a micro-hook of fear beginning to dawn in his eyes. He saw the way she walked, not as a servant, but as a sovereign. Little did he know, the kitchen decree was the last order his mother would ever give on this island. The kitchen was a stark, stainless steel contrast to the mahogany warmth of the grand hall. While the elite laughed over their poached lobster, Sloane sat on a simple wooden stool near the prep station, her silver tray resting against a stack of industrial-sized flour bags. The air here didn't smell like expensive cigars. It smelled of rosemary, sweat, and the quiet, simmering resentment of the staff who kept the island running. "Don't let them get to you, ma'am," Miller whispered as he slipped into the kitchen through the service door. He looked around to ensure none of the other servers were watching, his posture shifting into a respectful, military-grade stiffness. "They don't know who they're talking to." "They know exactly who they're talking to, Miller," Sloane replied, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "They're talking to the version of me they think they can control. The version that doesn't have a voice because she doesn't have a pedigree." Sloane reached into her canvas tote, the trash bag Barrett had wanted her to hide, and pulled out her hardware terminal. The green glow of the screen illuminated her refined features and strong cheekbones, a sharp contrast to the sterile kitchen lighting. She wasn't just checking her balance. She was watching the live internal data of Montgomery Construction. "Look at this, Miller," she said, tilting the screen toward him. The numbers were staggering. Richard Montgomery hadn't just used the bridge loan to save the firm. He had redirected a massive portion of the Guardian funds into a series of luxury developments in the Mediterranean, assets that weren't on the corporate books. He was cannibalizing the very money Sloane had sent to save his employees' jobs. "That's embezzlement," Miller breathed. "It's more than that. It's a breach of the character clause," Sloane stated, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "The contract I signed through my shell company explicitly forbids the diversion of funds into personal real estate. They haven't just been arrogant, they've been criminal." "What are your orders?" "Keep the satellite link open," Sloane said, closing the terminal. "I want the board members to feel completely safe tonight. I want them to talk about their untouchable status. Because when the sun hits the jetty tomorrow morning, they won't even own the shoes they're wearing." Miller nodded and slipped away just as Genevieve swept into the kitchen, her bone-white linen suit looking wildly out of place among the industrial stoves. She looked at Sloane with a gaze of quiet superiority, her lips curled in a permanent sneer. "Are you finished with your little pity party, Sloane? Or are you ready to be useful?" Genevieve asked. "I'm ready, Genevieve," Sloane said, standing up with a grace that made the older woman blink. "I'm ready to settle the accounts." Genevieve Montgomery didn't believe in apologies, she believed in payoffs. She led Sloane out of the kitchen and into the dimly lit rose garden, where the scent of damp earth and floral perfume created a suffocating, atmospheric tension. The moon was high over the Atlantic, casting a silver light on Genevieve's hyper-attractive, unsmiling face. "Let's be honest with each other, Sloane," Genevieve began, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "Barrett is a man with a destiny. He is destined for a seat on the board, a marriage to a woman with a legacy, and a life that doesn't involve riding the subway to a studio apartment." "Destiny is a funny thing," Sloane replied, her posture composed and socially dominant. "Sometimes it's built on a foundation of sand." "Save your riddles for the library," Genevieve snapped. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a gold-embossed check. She didn't hand it to Sloane. She dropped it onto a small stone bench between them. $15,000. "It's more than you make in a year as an assistant. Take it and leave the island on the 6 a.m. supply boat. Disappear from my son's life. And I won't have to explain to our friends why my son spent a year dating a project." Sloane looked down at the check. $15,000. It was less than what her private fund yielded in a single afternoon. The insult wasn't just in the amount. It was in the assumption that her love and her dignity had a price tag that Genevieve could afford. 15,000? Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a sophisticated, dangerous hum. That's the value of a Montgomery's conscience. I take it? It's a generous exit fee for a girl who brings a canvas bag to a private island, Genevieve replied, her gaze intense and controlled. Take it, or I'll have security remove you without a cent. And trust me, dear, my security doesn't care about your feelings. Sloane felt a micro-hook of pure, cinematic vindication. She picked up the check, her fingers tracing the expensive paper. You're right, Genevieve. Security follows the orders of the person who holds the keys, Sloane said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. I'll take the check, but I won't be the one leaving on the supply boat tomorrow. Don't be delusional, Genevieve sneered, turning to walk away. The world belongs to the people who can write the checks, Sloane, not the people who cash them. Then I suppose we're about to find out who truly owns this island, Sloane whispered to the empty garden. Sloane returned to the garden cottage, the $15,000 check tucked into her pocket like a piece of evidence. She didn't pack her things. She didn't cry. Instead, she sat on the edge of the iron bed and pulled the hardware terminal from her canvas tote. The atmospheric tension in the small room was palpable. Outside, she could hear the distant laughter of the elite from the manor, the tinkling of crystal, and the arrogant boom of Richard Montgomery's voice. She flipped the switch on the terminal, and a small satellite dish on the cottage roof, disguised as a weather vane, aligned with her private network. System active, a synthesized voice whispered. Sloane entered the decryption code for the Montgomery construction account. She watched as the digital walls of their firm's security dissolved. She could see everything now, the diverted funds, the secret Mediterranean bank accounts, and the falsified audit reports they had sent to the Guardian to keep the money flowing. Character clause violation detected. The screen flashed in high-contrast red. Execute total recall, Sloane commanded, her voice possessing a quiet, terrifying superiority. Pull the bridge loan. Freeze the island's operating credit. And deactivate every corporate credential associated with the name Montgomery. In an instant, the digital signal pulsed through the ether. Across the island, the infrastructure began to react. In the manor, the high-speed Wi-Fi vanished. The automated security gates locked. The corporate-linked credit cards in the pockets of the bullies were instantly rendered as useless as plastic play money. Sloane leaned back, her luminous skin catching the green glow of the terminal. She felt the true power of her $200,000 monthly yield, not for the things it could buy, but for the justice it could enforce. Barrett burst into the cottage a moment later, his masculine jawline set in a mask of panic. Sloane, something's wrong with the network. My father's accounts are frozen, and the CFO is saying the Guardian just pulled the funding. Do you have a phone I can use? My corporate line is dead. Sloane looked at him, her gaze intense and composed. She didn't hide the terminal this time. I have a phone, Barrett, she said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous purr. But I don't think you're going to like the call I'm about to make. Because the Guardian didn't just pull the funding. She's currently sitting in your garden cottage, waiting for you to apologize for the seating chart. The ownership shock was just beginning. The arrogant bullies had invited a ghost to their dinner, and now the ghost was about to haunt their every bank account. The air in the garden cottage was thick with the scent of ozone and the humming vibration of the hardware terminal. Barrett stood frozen in the center of the small room, his masculine jawline trembling with a mixture of confusion and building terror. He looked at the glowing green screen of the device Sloane held, then back at her. The woman standing before him wasn't the naive project he had been dating. She was a sovereign in a cotton sundress. Sloane, what are you doing with a satellite terminal? Barrett asked, his voice cracking. That's high-level encryption. Where did you get that? I didn't get it, Barrett. I built it, Sloane replied, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous purr. Now, if you want to see why your father's world is currently melting down, I suggest we go to the main house. I think the board needs to hear from their guardian. Sloane didn't wait for him. She slung her canvas tote over her shoulder, the bag that held the keys to his family's survival, and walked out into the cool island night. Barrett followed like a ghost, his mind unable to bridge the gap between the girl who rode the subway and the woman currently commanding a global satellite link. They entered the grand hall just as the chaos reached its peak. The elite were no longer laughing. Richard Montgomery was standing at the head of the table, shouting at his dead phone, while Genevieve looked around with a hyper-attractive, unsmiling expression of pure panic. The CFO says the Guardian is on the line. Richard roared to the room. But my phone is dead. Everyone's phone is dead. How are we supposed to give the confirmation code? Sloane stepped into the circle of light, her rich caramel skin high contrast against the mahogany walls. She reached into her bag and pulled out her satellite phone. She didn't look at the board members. She looked at Barrett. You wanted to meet the investor, Richard? Sloane asked, her voice projecting with a quiet superiority that silenced the room. She tapped the screen and placed the phone on the table. This is Sloane Holloway. I am on speaker with the full Montgomery board. Ma'am, the voice of the firm's CFO crackled through the speaker, sounding breathless and terrified. The total recall has been initiated. All corporate credit is frozen. The bridge loan has been moved to a default status. We are awaiting your final command. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at the phone, then at Sloane. His face turned a shade of mottled gray that signaled the end of his dynasty. The speakerphone reveal had landed like a guillotine. The ownership shock was a physical weight in the grand hall. Genevieve was the first to move, her bone-white linen suit rustling as she stepped toward Sloane, her eyes flashing with a desperate, socially dominant rage. This is a prank, Genevieve shrieked. Barrett, tell her to stop this. She's some freelance assistant who lives in a hovel. She couldn't possibly be the Guardian. I don't live in a hovel, Genevieve. I live in an audit, Sloane said, her voice possessing a sophisticated power. I wanted to see if your son was capable of loving a human being without a bank account. He failed, and while he was failing, I spent the weekend reviewing your husband's Mediterranean developments. Richard slumped into his chair, the authority drained from his masculine features. You triggered the character clause. I triggered it the moment your wife told me to serve the shrimp. Richard, Sloane replied, her gaze intense and controlled. But I finalized it when I saw the $1.2 million you diverted from the employee payroll into your secret villas. You didn't just break our contract. You broke the law. The board members began to murmur, their arrogant bully energy turning into frantic self-preservation. They looked at Sloane with a newfound, terrified respect. She wasn't the server anymore. She was the landlord of their very lives. Sloane, please, Barrett whispered, stepping forward, his eyes conveying a sense of restrained tension and building pressure. We can talk about this. I loved you. I was just under a lot of stress from my parents. You didn't love me, Barrett. You loved the idea of a woman you could look down on to feel bigger, Sloane said, her refined features set in a mask of calm confidence. You sat at this table and watched your mother humiliate me, and you didn't say a word. In my world, that's called a total loss of value. Suddenly, the lights in the manor flickered and died, replaced by the red emergency strobes. Across the island, the infrastructure was responding to the credit freeze. The ownership shock was no longer just a realization. It was a physical reality. They were trapped on a private island with no power, no money, and a landlord who was done being naive. In the red glow of the emergency lights, the grand hall looked like the scene of a wreck. The scent of expensive food was now replaced by the smell of cold, salt-laden air as the automated climate control shut down. Sloane stood at the head of the table, her presence hyper-attractive and socially dominant in the high-contrast light. A man in a crisp white uniform burst through the doors, the island's general manager. He didn't look at Richard. He walked straight to Sloane and bowed deeply. Ma'am, the satellite link has confirmed the transfer, the manager stated. The Montgomery corporate accounts have been rejected by the island's primary terminal. The total operating bill for the reunion, including the catering, the staff, and the transport, comes to $52,400. He turned to Richard, his voice cold. Mr. Montgomery, since your firm is in default, the island's legacy lease has been voided. This dinner is now a private event on property owned by the Thorne Holloway Trust. If you wish to stay another hour, the bill must be settled in cash. Richard stared at the manager. Cash? I don't have $50,000 in cash. We're on a private island. Then I suppose you're trespassing, Sloane said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the $15,000 bribe check Genevieve had dropped in the garden. She tore it in half and let the pieces flutter onto Richard's empty plate. You offered me this to leave, Genevieve, Sloane said, looking at the older woman, whose hyper-attractive face was now a mask of horror. I think you're going to need it more than I do. But considering the $52,000 you owe for the dinner you haven't even finished, I'd say you're still a bit short. Barrett looked around at the elite guests, the people he had tried so hard to impress. They were already moving away from him, their faces conveying a quiet superiority as they distanced themselves from the contagion of the Montgomery bankruptcy. The bill is due, Barrett, Sloane whispered, leaning in so only he could hear her. And the price isn't money. It's the truth you were too cowardly to tell. Security, Sloane called out, her voice echoing through the vaulted hall. Please escort the Montgomery family to the garden cottage. Since they found it so appropriate for nothing people, they can spend their final night on the island there. I'll be taking the main suite. As the guards moved in, Sloane turned her back on the arrogant bullies, her canvas tote slung over her shoulder like a cape of victory. The nothing girl was gone, and the landlord was officially home. The sun rose over the Atlantic with a blinding, indifferent beauty, turning the green cliffs of the private island into a shimmering emerald fortress. But inside the garden cottage, the morning was anything but beautiful. The air was cold and stagnant, smelling of damp cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of the previous night's desperation. Genevieve Montgomery woke up on a thin, lumpy mattress, her bone-white linen suit now a wrinkled testament to her fall from grace. Barrett, she rasped, her hyper-attractive face looking haggard and unsmiling in the gray morning light. Barrett, get up. We need to find the manager. We need to get off this rock. Barrett was sitting on the edge of the other iron bed, his masculine jawline set in a mask of restrained tension. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the dark silhouette of the main manor, where the lights were already burning bright in the master suite. Sloane was up there, likely reviewing the very accounts that had destroyed him. The manager won't see us, Mother, Barrett said, his voice hollow. I tried the door an hour ago. It's locked from the outside. The security detail Miller is leading. They aren't Montgomery guards anymore. They never were. Don't be ridiculous, Genevieve snapped, standing up and smoothing her hair with a trembling hand. We are the Montgomerys. This island is our legacy. That girl, that nothing person, she's just playing a game of leverage. We'll offer her a higher settlement. We'll double the exit fee. She doesn't want our money, Mother. She has our money, Barrett replied, looking toward the window. Across the lawn, they could see the island's staff moving toward the manor. They weren't carrying cleaning supplies. They were carrying tablets and logistics reports. The morning aftermath revealed a truth they had been too arrogant to see. The island wasn't a playground for the elite, but a command center for the silent powerhouse. Sloane appeared on the manor's balcony, silhouetted against the rising sun. She was dressed in an understated, high-end navy silk wrap dress that signaled her absolute dominance over the environment. She didn't look down at the cottage. She looked out at the horizon, where a fleet of Thorne-Halloway supply ships was already docking. She's not just the guardian, Barrett whispered, a micro-hook of realization finally piercing his arrogance. She's the landlord of the entire region. And we just got served. By 10 a.m., the Montgomerys were standing on the private jetty, their single suitcases at their feet, looking like refugees from a high-stakes war. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the roar of the incoming tide. Miller, the head of security, stood at the base of the pier, his posture conveying a quiet superiority and intense, controlled authority. Where's the transport, Miller? Richard Montgomery barked, attempting to summon a ghost of his former power. We were told a boat would be ready at 9. We have business on the mainland. Miller didn't move. His gaze was fixed on a point just past Richard's shoulder, his expression entirely unsmiling. The mainland transport is for authorized personnel only, Mr. Montgomery. As of midnight, your corporate travel privileges have been revoked by the Thorne-Halloway Trust. Revoked? I pay your salary. Richard roared, stepping toward the guard. Actually, sir, Miller said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. The trust pays my salary. It always has. Your firm was merely a client. a client that is currently in breach of the staff connection clause. Genevieve stepped forward, her refined features set in a mask of social dominance. Miller, let's not be difficult. You've seen me at every gala for 10 years. Tell the captain to start the catamaran. I'll make sure you get a substantial bonus. I don't need a bonus from a bankrupt account, ma'am, Miller replied, his eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. This staff connection is simple. We work for people with character. And after watching you treat Ms. Holloway like a servant for the last 48 hours, the captain has decided he doesn't feel like sailing for you. Barrett looked back toward the manor. Sloane was standing at the entrance, her arms crossed, her presence composed and socially dominant. She wasn't just watching them. She was letting them see exactly how isolated they were. The island was a prison of their own making, a place where their legacy carried no weight because they had treated the people around them as invisible. The only boat leaving today is the supply scow at noon, Miller added, his voice projecting with a quiet superiority. It's where the nothing people travel. I'd suggest you get in line. The Montgomerys stood in the silence of the jetty, realized that the staff connection was the final cord being cut. They were no longer the elite. They were just 3 more trespassers waiting for a ride they couldn't afford to pay for. The manor's grand dining hall had been transformed into a cold, clinical boardroom. The dark mahogany table, once set with crystal and silver, was now covered in tablets, forensic accounting ledgers, and the high-contrast green glow of Sloane's satellite terminals. Sloane sat at the head of the table, her luminous dark brown skin looking radiant against the ivory silk of her executive blazer. Opposite her sat the board members of Montgomery Construction, their masculine features conveying a sense of intense pressure and building panic. Richard and Barrett were conspicuously absent, barred from the room by the very security they once thought they owned. Let's begin the boardroom execution, Sloane said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous purr that silenced the room. We've finished the forensic audit of the Guardian funds. As of 3 hours ago, we have documented $1.2 million in direct embezzlement by Richard Montgomery for personal luxury assets. Ma'am, we had no idea, the senior director stammered, his eyes darting toward the satellite link where the firm's CFO was already in tears. Incompetence is not a defense against the character clause, gentlemen, Sloane stated, her gaze intense and controlled. The clause allows for total asset reclamation if the board fails in its fiduciary duty. By ignoring Richard's Mediterranean developments, you have forfeited your right to lead. Sloane tapped a key on her terminal. The monitors on the wall flashed with a series of termination notices and asset freeze commands. The board members watched, their masculine jawlines set in a mask of total shock, as their corporate world was systematically dismantled in real time. The Montgomery family is being liquidated, Sloane continued, her voice possessing a quiet superiority. The island lease is void. The firm's remaining capital will be used to restore the employee pension fund that Richard was preparing to raid next. The boardroom execution was finished in less than 20 minutes. The elite of the city had been reduced to nothing by the charity case they had invited to dinner. Sloane stood up, her posture regal and socially dominant. The supply boat is leaving in an hour, she said, looking at the directors. I suggest you be on it. I have new tenants arriving tomorrow. People who actually understand the value of a foundation. As she walked toward the door, she felt the true peace of her $200,000 monthly yield, the power to ensure that those who built their lives on sand finally felt the weight of the water. The master study of the Montgomery Manor was a temple of leather, old books, and the lingering scent of Richard's expensive pipe tobacco. Sloane sat behind the massive oak desk, her rich caramel skin glowing in the light of the morning sun, as she reviewed the final set of digital logs recovered from Barrett's personal laptop. She had expected arrogance. She had expected cowardice. She had not expected a predator. Marcus, she said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum as her head of security entered the room. Tell me I'm misinterpreting these encrypted outgoing messages from Barrett's local drive. Marcus stepped forward, his expression entirely unsmiling and professional. I wish I could, ma'am. It appears Barrett wasn't just waiting for his father's firm to be saved. He was actively trying to sell your proprietary Guardian trade flow algorithms to a rival firm in the Mediterranean. Sloane felt a micro-hook of cold, clinical clarity. She scrolled through the messages. Barrett had been taking screenshots of her work while she slept in their shared studio apartment. He had described her as a naive resource and a disposable bridge to the buyer. He wasn't just a man who failed a test of character. He was a man who had been planning to harvest her life and leave her with nothing once he had secured his seat on the board. He was going to frame me for the Guardian Fund's eventual collapse, Sloane whispered, her gaze intense and controlled. He had a dossier prepared for the authorities, painting me as a fraudulent assistant who had stolen his family's intellectual property. The deeper betrayal is complete, ma'am, Marcus added. He didn't just let his mother humiliate you. He was the one who suggested the garden cottage to keep you away from the network hub while he finalized the data transfer. Sloane stood up, her posture regal and socially dominant. The ivory silk of her blazer shimmered as she looked out at the island she now fully controlled. The silent powerhouse within her no longer felt pity. The man she had thought was a project was actually a parasite. Ensure the authorities have these logs before the supply boat docks, Sloane commanded, her voice possessing a quiet superiority. The Montgomerys were worried about a contagion of poverty. It's time they realized that the real rot was sitting at their own dinner table. The public humiliation began at exactly 11:30 a.m. The elite guests, the board members, the socialites, and the legacy partners were gathered on the terrace, waiting for their own departures. But all eyes were fixed on the three figures being escorted down the main lawn by a wall of security guards in black and gold Thorn Halloway uniforms. Richard, Genevieve, and Barrett Montgomery walked in a tight, desperate line. They weren't being driven in the island's luxury SUVs. They were walking, each of them forced to carry their own heavy designer suitcases across the gravel. Genevieve's bone-white suit was stained with dust, her hyper-attractive face a mask of frantic, unsmiling panic as she saw her former friends watching her fall. "Barrett, do something," she hissed, her voice cracking over the sound of the surf. "Tell them they can't treat us like this. We are the Montgomerys." Barrett didn't answer. His masculine jawline was set in a mask of restrained tension, his eyes fixed on the pier where the supply scow, a rusty, industrial vessel smelling of diesel and fish, was waiting. The nothing people, the kitchen staff, the groundskeepers, and the valets, stood along the path, their arms crossed, their expressions conveying a quiet superiority. "Your luggage, Mr. Montgomery," Miller, the security head, said as they reached the dock. He didn't offer to help. He simply pointed to the rusted deck of the scow. "I have a heart condition," Richard roared, his face mottled. "I cannot be expected to board that piece of scrap." "The scrap is the only thing your current credit rating can afford, sir," Miller replied, his voice a low, dangerous hum. The elite guests on the terrace began to whisper, their phones out, capturing this spotlight drop of the century. The Montgomerys, the family that had ruled the region's social and financial circles for 3 generations, were being loaded onto a supply boat like discarded freight. Barrett looked up toward the manor's balcony. Sloane was standing there, center-weighted and powerful, her gaze intense as she watched the arrogant bullies reach the edge of their world. She didn't wave. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, a sovereign witnessing the final removal of a liability. The humiliation was total, and the audience was the very world they had tried to impress with stolen money. The supply scow groaned against the jetty as the tide pulled at its rusted hull. The Montgomerys stood on the deck, surrounded by crates of industrial detergent and bags of salt, looking like ghosts of the people they had been 48 hours ago. The Montgomery exile was no longer a threat. It was a physical movement away from the heights of power. Barrett broke away from his parents, rushing to the railing as the engines began to thrum. "Sloane," he screamed toward the manor, his voice raw with a sense of building pressure and desperation. "Sloane, I can explain the messages. I was doing it for us. I was going to secure our future so you'd never have to live in that studio again." Sloane appeared at the base of the jetty, having walked down the cliff path with a speed and grace that left Barrett breathless. She stood just feet away from the boat, her presence composed and socially dominant. She reached into her canvas tote and pulled out a single black and gold folder, the evidence of his industrial espionage. "You weren't securing our future, Barrett," she said, her voice projecting with a quiet superiority that cut through the engine noise. "You were trying to sell my soul to buy yourself a throne. You called me a naive resource. You should have checked the resource's security logs before you started typing." Barrett's face went white. The ownership shock had reached its final, most personal level. "I loved you," he whispered, a final, cowardly lie. "You loved the feeling of being the only person who knew I was a diamond in the rough," Sloane replied, her gaze unyielding. "But you didn't realize that the diamond was already cut, and it was sharper than you could handle. The scow will take you to the public docks. My lawyers will meet you there, not for a divorce, since you never earned the right to marry me, but for the criminal charges. You're destroying us." Genevieve shrieked from the background, her hyper-attractive face now a mask of pure, ugly defeat. "No, Genevieve," Sloane said, turning away. "I'm just delivering the bill, and your credit has officially run out." The boat pulled away, the gap between the jetty and the Montgomerys widening into a chasm they could never cross again. Sloane stood at the edge of the pier, her canvas bag over her shoulder, watching the arrogant bullies disappear into the gray horizon. The nothing girl was the only one left on the island, and the silence she had bought was finally, truly her own. The Montgomery Manor, once a shrine to inherited arrogance and stolen wealth, was breathing for the first time in 3 generations. The heavy, suffocating velvet curtains had been stripped away, replaced by expansive walls of glass that invited the Atlantic sun to scour the dark corners of the mahogany-paneled rooms. Sloane Holloway sat at the center of the grand hall, her rich, luminous dark brown skin looking radiant against her ivory silk executive blazer. She wasn't holding a silver tray. She was holding a digital tablet that displayed the foundation shift blueprints. "The restructuring is nearly complete, Ms. Holloway," her lead auditor stated, bowing slightly with a look of profound respect. "The Montgomery construction firm has been legally dissolved and absorbed into the Holloway Trust. We've recovered the $1.2 million in embezzled funds, and as per your character clause, it's been redirected into the new vocational scholarship fund." Sloane nodded, her gaze intense and composed. "And the island staff?" "Miller's team. They've all been offered permanent equity in the trust," the auditor replied. "The gardeners, the chefs, the security, they aren't nothing people anymore. They are stakeholders." Sloane stood up, her presence socially dominant and hyper-attractive. She walked to the window, looking out at the jetty where the rusted supply scow had departed just 24 hours ago. The foundation shift wasn't just about money. It was about the cold, clinical removal of a parasite and the restoration of the soul. She felt the true power of her $200,000 monthly yield, the power to ensure that a name like Montgomery never again carried the weight of a god. "Prepare the island for the first group of residents," Sloane commanded, her voice possessing a quiet superiority. "The manor will no longer be a clubhouse for the elite. It will be a school for those who were told they didn't have the pedigree to build empires. I want the gates open by Monday." The shift was absolute. The arrogant bullies were gone, and the silent powerhouse was finally building on a foundation of truth. Sloane looked at her canvas tote bag, still resting on the marble table. It was no longer a mask of poverty. It was a relic of the test she had finally passed. A week after the exile, a different kind of visitor arrived at the Holloway Trust. A sleek, midnight blue helicopter descended onto the manor's new helipad, its blades cutting through the salt air with a rhythmic, high-status thrum. Sloane stood on the lawn to meet it, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun that emphasized her strong cheekbones and luminous dark brown skin. A man stepped out of the craft, his presence conveying a quiet dominance and restrained tension. He was in his late 30s, with a healthy, light-warm complexion and a masculine jawline that looked like it had been carved from the same Atlantic cliffs that surrounded the island. He wasn't dressed in a flashy suit. He wore an understated navy cashmere sweater and tailored wool trousers that whispered of a wealth far deeper than anything the Montgomerys had ever touched. "Caspian Rook," Sloane said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum as she stepped forward. "I didn't expect the architect of the North to visit a work in progress." Caspian looked at Sloane, his sharp, controlled eyes meeting hers with an intensity that didn't hold a hint of arrogance or playfulness. He scanned the manor, then looked back at the woman standing before him. He didn't see a project or a liability. he saw appear. "I don't visit work in progresses, Sloane," Caspian replied, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "I visit shifts in the market." The moment you triggered the character clause on a dynasty like the Montgomerys, the entire elite world took notice. I wanted to see if the woman who owned the keys was as unyielding as the papers claimed. "And?" Sloane asked, her gaze intense and controlled. "And I think you're being too modest," Caspian stated, a ghost of a smile touching his masculine features. "You didn't just reclaim an island. You've created a new blueprint for power. I'm starting a project on the coast that requires a guardian who isn't afraid to pull the floor out from under the corrupt. I think our funds should meet." Sloane felt a micro-hook of genuine attraction. For the first time, she was standing before a man who saw her $200,000 monthly yield as a starting point, not a threat. The Ice King had arrived, and he wasn't here to buy her. He was here to build with her. That evening, Sloane stood on the manor balcony with Caspian Rook, the sunset casting a warm, high-contrast glow over her rich caramel skin and the deep navy of his sweater. The air was sensory-rich, smelling of sea salt, cedar, and the promise of a future that no longer required a mask. For the first time in 18 months, Sloane felt a sovereign peace that had nothing to do with her bank account and everything to do with her soul. "Barrett contacted my office this morning," Caspian said, leaning against the marble railing with a quiet confidence. "He was looking for a bridge loan to cover his mother's legal fees. He didn't know I was already on your island." "And?" Sloane asked, looking at the city lights beginning to flicker in the distance. "I told him that Rook Capital doesn't invest in shadows," Caspian replied, his gaze intense. "I told him he should have valued the diamond he had instead of trying to sell it for glass." He hung up when he heard your name in the background. Sloane smiled, a small, predatory brilliance touching her full lips. The nothing girl had finally left the building, and the chairwoman was finally at home. She thought of her $200,000 private fund, the secret she had guarded so fiercely. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was the foundation of the Holloway Trust, a force for justice that would be felt for generations. "The supply boat returns tomorrow with the first students," Sloane said, turning to Caspian. "Would the Ice King stay to witness the first lesson?" "I wouldn't miss it, Sloane," Caspian said, his voice a low, dangerous purr that signaled the start of a new, powerful partnership. "I think we have a lot to teach this world about what legacy really means." The arrogant bullies were a fading echo, and the silent powerhouse was finally standing in her own light. The test was over, the audit was closed, and Sloane Holloway was finally exactly where she belonged, at the head of the table. The apartment on 4th Street smelled of stale grease and industrial-grade lemon cleaner, a far cry from the salt-air luxury of the private island. Genevieve Montgomery stood in the center of the cramped living room, her bone-white linen suit now permanently stained and frayed at the cuffs. She was holding a heavy velvet jewelry box, her hyper-attractive features set in a mask of unsmiling, frantic desperation. "They won't take them, Barrett," she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at her son. "The jeweler on 5th, he told me my pedigree was no longer a valid currency. He offered me a fraction of their value, saying they were tainted by the audit." Barrett sat at a chipped laminate table, his masculine jawline set in a mask of restrained tension and mounting pressure. He looked at his phone, the same phone he had once used to try and sell Sloane's soul, and saw only a string of delivery-failed notifications. His social circle had performed a total social death on the Montgomery family. The emails were ignored. The private club memberships were terminated. Even the legacy friends they had known for decades had blocked their numbers. "We're invisible, Mother," Barrett said, his voice a hollow echo of its former arrogance. "In this city, if you don't have the Holloway seal of approval, you don't exist. I saw Sterling yesterday at the market. He looked right through me like I was made of glass." Across the city, Sloane Holloway was the only name that mattered. The news cycle was dominated by images of her at the helm of the new Holloway Trust, her rich caramel skin high contrast against the sharp, ivory silk of her executive attire. She was being hailed as the architect of integrity, the woman who had dismantled a dynasty to save a workforce. Genevieve turned on the television, only to see Sloane standing on the island jetty, shaking hands with Caspian Rook. Caspian's light, warm complexion and masculine jawline radiated a quiet dominance that made Genevieve's breath hitch with envy and rage. "She's with the Ice King now," Genevieve hissed, her gaze intense and controlled even in her defeat. "She took our island, our firm, and now she's taking the only partnership that could have saved us." "She didn't take it, Mother," Barrett replied, looking at the gray, peeling wallpaper. "She just stopped pretending she didn't own it already." The Montgomerys were realizing that the hovel they were in wasn't a temporary stop, it was their new reality. The social death was complete. They were ghosts in a city that had found a new, more powerful light to follow. Desperation has a specific scent. It's the smell of sweat-stained polyester and cheap, lukewarm coffee. Barrett Montgomery stood in a long line at the new Holloway Logistics Hub, clutching a folder that contained his experience portfolio. He had replaced his charcoal wool overcoat with a generic blazer he'd found at a thrift store, trying to mask his masculine jawline and sharp, controlled eyes with a look of humble persistence. He didn't realize that the software processing the applications was the very algorithm Sloan had perfected while he thought she was a naive resource. Next, a voice called out. Barrett stepped forward, sitting across from a young woman who looked at him with a gaze of quiet superiority. She wore a small silver pin with the Thorn Holloway crest, the same crest he had once mocked on a canvas tote. "I'm applying for the regional project manager position," Barrett said, attempting to summon a ghost of his former authority. "I have 15 years of experience at Montgomery Construction. I helped oversee the Mediterranean developments." The woman didn't look at his resume. She looked at her screen, where a high-contrast red alert was already flashing. "Mr. Montgomery, our system flags all former board members of liquidated firms for a character audit prior to interview." "I wasn't involved in the financial discrepancies," Barrett lied, his posture conveying a sense of building pressure and restrained tension. "I was just a manager. I'm a hard worker. I just need a chance to prove my value to the Holloway Trust." Suddenly, the glass doors of the hub opened, and the room went silent. Sloan Holloway entered, flanked by Caspian Rook. Sloan was center-weighted and powerful, her rich, luminous dark brown skin looking radiant in the high-floor executive light. She looked toward the applicant desk, her intense, confident gaze landing directly on Barrett. Barrett stood up, a micro-hook of hope flaring in his chest. Sloan, tell them I'm the best manager you know." Sloan stopped. She looked at him for a long, cinematic moment. She didn't look angry. She looked composed and socially dominant, as if she were looking at a piece of data that had finally been sorted into the correct file. "The character audit is complete, Barrett," Sloan said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum that carried across the hub. "And the result is the same as it was on the island. You have plenty of experience in building on sand, but this firm only builds on truth." "Please," he whispered, the desperate application crumbling in his hands. "The position has been filled," Sloan stated, her head turned back toward him with an unblinking gaze of quiet superiority. "By Miller. The man you once called to help is now your superior. If you want a job, he's looking for someone to clear the rubble at the old manor site. I suggest you start there." The reclamation was more than a renovation. It was a sensory-rich rebirth. Sloan stood on the cliffs of the island, her ivory silk blazer catching the gold of the afternoon sun as she watched the first transport boat dock at the jetty. This time, the boat didn't smell like diesel and desperation. It was filled with 50 young students, their eyes wide as they saw the Holloway Center for Resilience for the first time. Caspian Rook stood beside her, his masculine jawline and sharp, controlled eyes reflecting a quiet dominance that was now perfectly aligned with her own. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but never overstepping, a sign of the absolute peer-level respect they had built. "The first lesson starts in an hour, Sloan," Caspian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Are you ready to tell them how a nothing girl becomes the architect of a new world?" "I'm ready to tell them that they were never nothing to begin with, Caspian," Sloan replied, her gaze intense and confident. "I'm going to teach them that a canvas tote can hold more power than a silk pocket square if it's carried with integrity." As the students filed past, Sloan saw Miller at the head of the pier, his posture conveying a quiet superiority as he directed the new arrivals with a profound, professional kindness. The island was finally exactly what it was meant to be, a fortress of character. Down in the city, Barrett Montgomery was standing in the mud of the old manor site, a shovel in his hand and a look of building pressure in his eyes. He looked up at the sky as a Thorne Holloway helicopter buzzed overhead, carrying Sloane and Caspian to their next boardroom. He realized then that the reclamation was a door that had closed behind him forever. Sloane leaned back in the plush leather seat of the craft, her $200,000 monthly yield finally being used for a legacy that didn't require a mask. She looked at her reflection in the glass, powerful, socially dominant, and hyper-attractive, and felt a profound peace. To the next project? Caspian asked, his eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance and shared ambition. To the next truth, Sloane said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum. The silent powerhouse was no longer silent, and the arrogant bullies were just a story people told to remind themselves that the landlord is always watching. The light inside the Thorne Holloway legal war room was clinical, white, and unforgiving. Sloane Holloway sat at the center of the glass-topped table, her ivory silk executive blazer reflecting the glow of a dozen monitors. She was no longer testing anyone. She was executing the final phase of a plan that had begun months ago in a cramped studio apartment. Beside her, Caspian Rook leaned back, his masculine jawline set in a mask of calm confidence as he reviewed the final audit. "It's not just embezzlement, Sloane," Caspian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "The audit has uncovered a secondary layer of fraud. Richard Montgomery wasn't just stealing from the pension fund. He was using the island's legacy lease to launder money for an offshore construction cartel." Sloane felt a micro-hook of ice settle in her chest. She scrolled through the high-contrast data feeds on her tablet. The silent powerhouse within her had expected greed, but this was a systematic betrayal of the very city the Montgomerys claimed to lead. "He wasn't just an arrogant bully," Sloane whispered, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "He was a parasite who would have eventually destroyed the entire regional economy to keep his wife in pearls." "The evidence is ironclad," Caspian added. "The authorities have already been briefed. But there's a final detail you need to see. Barrett's signature is on the laundering sub-agreements." Sloane paused. She looked at the digital signature, the same hand that had written her goodnight notes in their shared flat. Barrett hadn't just been a coward who let his mother humiliate her. He had been the primary architect of the secondary fraud. He had planned to use the $200,000 Guardian yield to cover the holes in his criminal books. "The deeper betrayal never ends with these people," Sloane said, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum. "They don't see human beings. They see conduits for their own survival." Marcus, her head of security, stepped into the light. "Ma'am, execute the spotlight drop. Send the full audit, unredacted, to the district attorney and the financial press. I want the world to see the rot before they even reach the courtroom." The criminal audit was the final nail in the Montgomery coffin. By noon, the city's financial networks were flashing the headline: "Montgomery Dynasty built on cartel cash. Guardian investor Sloane Holloway exposes fraud." The family that had spent decades looking down on ordinary people was now being revealed as the most common kind of criminal. Sloane stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She saw the city she had quietly protected, and she felt the true weight of her $200,000 monthly yield. It wasn't just a fund. It was the fuel for a machine of justice that was finally, truly, running at full speed. The courtroom was a sensory-rich theater of status and shame. The air smelled of floor wax and the cold, metallic scent of high-stakes litigation. In the gallery sat the elite, the socialites and board members who had once bowed to the Montgomerys, now watching with a gaze of quiet superiority as the dynasty was dismantled in the public eye. Richard and Barrett Montgomery sat at the defense table, their masculine features conveying a sense of intense pressure and total displacement. Genevieve was in the front row, her designer suit looking like a costume on her haggard, unsmiling face. When the doors opened, a silence fell over the room that was more powerful than any judge's gavel. Sloane Holloway entered, center-weighted and powerful. She was dressed in an understated, high-end navy wool dress that fit her like armor. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, emphasizing her symmetrical, refined features and her luminous dark brown skin. She walked to the witness stand with a posture that radiated social dominance. "Ms. Holloway," the prosecutor began, "can you explain why you placed a character clause in the Montgomery Bridge loan?" "Because in my world, integrity is the only asset that cannot be faked," Sloan replied, her voice projecting with a quiet superiority that cut through the room. The clause was designed to detect the moment a partner began to value their own arrogance over their fiduciary duty. The Montgomerys didn't just fail a test. They proved that they were a liability to everyone they touched. Barrett stood up, his masculine jawline set in a mask of restrained tension. "Sloan, please. Tell them it was my father. I was just following orders. I loved you. The order to sell my algorithms to a rival firm was written from your personal IP, Barrett," Sloan said, her head turned back toward him with an unblinking gaze of quiet superiority. "You didn't love me. You loved the idea of a woman you could use as a shield while you looted her life. In this courtroom, the nothing girl is the one with the evidence. And the evidence says you are a thief." The courtroom confrontation was the final social death of Barrett Montgomery. He slumped back into his chair, realizing that the woman he had tried to save with a studio apartment was the one currently sealing his cell door. As Sloan stepped down from the stand, she passed Genevieve. The older woman reached out, her fingers trembling. You took our legacy. You destroyed my family." "No, Genevieve," Sloan whispered, leaning in with an intense, confident gaze. "I just took back the island. You're the one who destroyed the family. I'm just the auditor who counted the cost." The auction of the Montgomery assets took place in the very grand hall where Genevieve had once tried to bribe Sloan with $15,000. The air was thick with the scent of fine cedar and the sharp, rhythmic sound of the auctioneer's gavel. Every piece of their legacy, the oil paintings, the silver, even the Louis XIV chairs Genevieve had prized, was being sold off to cover the $1.2 million embezzlement and the legal fines. Sloan sat in the back of the room, her posture composed and socially dominant. Caspian Rook was beside her, his sharp, controlled eyes watching the room with a quiet dominance that signaled his new partnership with Sloan was the only power that remained on the island. "The painting of the Montgomery patriarch, sold," the auctioneer cried, "to the Thorne Holloway Trust." Sloan didn't even look up. She was reviewing the list of former Montgomery employees who were now receiving their restored pension checks. The final liquidation wasn't just about reclaiming money. It was about the total erasure of a name that had stood for exclusion. Genevieve stood in the doorway, a ghost in her own house. She watched as her family's history was loaded into Thorne Holloway trucks. She saw the nothing girl she had mocked now sitting in the chair of the sovereign. "What will you do with it all?" Genevieve asked, her voice a hollow shell of its former dominance. "I'm turning the manor into the Holloway Academy," Sloan replied, her voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum. "The paintings will be replaced by the work of our students. The silver will be sold to fund the first 5 years of their tuition. Your legacy is finally going to be useful to someone, Genevieve. Just not to you." Barrett arrived at the manor a few hours later, his desperate application finally rejected by the regional board. He found Sloan on the jetty, watching the last truck pull away. He looked at her, his eyes conveying a sense of restrained tension and final, crushing defeat. "I have nothing left, Sloan," he said, his voice raw. "You have your character, Barrett," Sloan said, not turning around. "It's just a shame that after all this time, you finally realized it's worth zero." The final liquidation was complete. The Montgomerys were no longer the elite. They were a cautionary tale whispered in the very circles they had once ruled. Sloan stood on her island, her canvas tote bag at her side, the only item she had kept from her old life. It was a reminder that you don't need a silk pocket square to hold a world together. 2 months after the trial, Sloan sat on the balcony of her island manor, the Atlantic sun warming her rich caramel skin. She was wearing a simple, high-end linen wrap dress, her $200,000 monthly yield now a routine part of a massive, thriving foundation. Beside her, Caspian Rook was reviewing a blueprint for their new coastal project, a sustainable harbor that would employ 5,000 people. "You look peaceful, Sloan," Caspian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that signaled a deep, peer-level respect. "I am," Sloan replied, her gaze intense and confident. "The audit is closed. The Montgomerys are in their district flat. The students are thriving. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. The nothing girl mask served its purpose, Caspian said, setting down the blueprint. But I think the chairwoman is a much more interesting conversation. Sloane felt a micro-hook of the grand final twist for her own heart. She had lived in the shadow to protect herself from the arrogant bullies of the world. But in Caspian, she had found someone who didn't need her to be naive to feel powerful. He saw her $200,000 secret and didn't see a score. He saw a foundation. I have a confession, Caspian said, his sharp, controlled eyes meeting hers with a quiet dominance that was now laced with a rare, genuine warmth. I knew who the Guardian was 6 months ago. I didn't visit this island to see if you were unyielding. I visited because I wanted to see if the woman who built an empire from a studio apartment was as resilient as her algorithms. Sloane smiled, a predatory brilliance touching her lips. And I think I've finally met my match, Caspian said, his hand hovering over hers on the marble railing. The heart's twist wasn't that she had found a billionaire. It was that she had finally found someone who didn't want to own her, but to build alongside her. The test of character she had put Barrett through had led her to the one man who had already passed it without knowing she was grading him. The new legacy was officially launched on a clear, salt-scented Monday morning. Sloane Holloway stood on the jetty of her island, watching the first graduates of the Holloway Academy board the transport ship to their new jobs in the city. She wasn't carrying a silver tray, and she wasn't hiding behind a sundress. She was Sloane Holloway, and the world finally knew exactly what that meant. She looked at her reflection in the dark, polished hull of the ship, powerful, socially dominant, and hyper-attractive. Her $200,000 monthly yield was no longer a shadow fund. It was the heartbeat of a new social order. In the city, Barrett Montgomery was clearing rubble from a construction site, his masculine jawline set in a mask of building pressure. He looked up at the digital billboard above the site, where Sloane's face was displayed alongside the headline, "Integrity is the new currency." He looked at the shovel in his hand and realized that the nothing girl had been the only real thing in his life, and he had traded her for a world that was now selling his childhood home. Sloane turned to Caspian, who was standing at the edge of the pier, his masculine features reflecting a quiet dominance that was now perfectly aligned with her own. "Are you ready for the next project, Sloane?" Caspian asked, his voice a sophisticated, dangerous hum. "I am," Sloane said, her voice warm and unyielding. "Because the foundation is solid. And this time, there are no hollow pillars." Hi, my beautiful story family. Thank you for staying with me through Sloane's journey from the studio apartment to the heights of the Atlantic cliffs. If this story reminded you that your value is intrinsic and that no one has the right to make you feel small, drop a heart in the comments. Remember, you are a masterpiece, and your character is the only currency that never devalues. Subscribe to our family to stay safe, stay resilient, and ensure that every arrogant bully in your path meets their own audit. Until next time, keep starting with love always.